And I think we'll find some of the radioactive concerns starting to be addressed in the way the waste from injection wells is being stored as well. But we'll let Brian take the stage here. Brian Kunkemoeller from the Sierra Club.
Thanks, Bill. How many folks here are Sierra Club members already? All right, I got one. All right, cool. How many folks already know about injection wells? Okay, so not everyone. Okay, good. Because I prepared a fracking or injection well 101 presentation, so maybe I can get a little bit more detailed, and particularly if people have more detailed questions, maybe we can get a conversation. The Sierra Club was founded on the 28th of May of 1892, so yesterday was our 122nd birthday. We were founded by John Muir. He was a conservationist, and he believed that the natural environment had actual value beyond just the enjoyment of the outdoors. And so our motto is enjoy, explore, protect the planet. We are one of the largest environmental organizations in the country. In Ohio, we have about 18,000 members, and then we have about, those are just people who pay them $15 whatever year for the membership. Then we have about 100,000 people on our list of people that have taken actions through our online advocacy component. People will support us in various other actions. Nationally, we have our Beyond Coal campaign. It's one of the most successful environmental campaigns in the history of environmentalism. They have negotiated the closure of 180 coal plants now. And so our number one agenda right now is to move beyond fossil fuels into clean energy as a means to address climate change, which is the biggest environmental issue, and possibly one of the biggest social issues facing the world today. How that translates into natural gas. Obviously, we don't believe that natural gas is a sustainable bridge fuel. The more that we start to look at the research, we recognize that you're moving the carbon pollution from the coal smokestacks to the methane pollution at the drilling site, and you're more or less breaking even. There's not very much of a net gain in terms of mitigating climate change by moving to drilling from coal. So in Ohio specifically, we're looking at a couple of different pieces. I think number one, our priority is to keep our public lands off limits. Ohio is 47th in the country in public lands per capita. We have pushed very, very hard to keep our state parks and keep state forests, to keep those from becoming these highly industrialized drilling areas. We're also looking a lot at the waste, particularly the injection wells are something we've been very concerned about. It's a huge environmental justice issue. A lot of these injection wells, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, are in depressed communities. We supported a state ban on injection wells. We're also working with the US EPA to push forward on a really strong audit of the Ohio Department of Natural Resources implementation of that program. And we're looking at the rule packages, like Melanie was talking about. We also have a Water Sentinel program where we have members around the state that do these Water Sentinel trainings. You went that side already. Where you can learn how to do basic water tests, and you can recognize when things in your water change. And we put a lot of focus in some of these affected communities and getting these testing kits in their hands. That our Clean Water campaign is a partnership with Aveda, so please do get your hair cut at Aveda. No, you can stay right there for a minute. We also, and if needed, we explore strategic litigation for when things are really getting out of hand. Our newest project from the fracking front is we are really looking at the kind of egregious influence that the oil and gas industry has over the democratic process. They enjoy luxuries, whether it's through legislation or whether it's through the rulemaking process. We've seen through the public records again, that they have almost a revolving backdoor to the Ohio Department of Natural Resources in the State House to get the rules rolled back to a place where it's happy for them. And it's kind of telling to what the kind of political will is in the State House when we're finding documents crafted in the governor's office naming the Ohio Sierra Club as a target to marginalize and to smear through public relations, and in order for them to be able to move forward in drilling public lands, that it's more or less the industry and the regulator, the folks who are supposed to be regulating them, are one and the same. They're walking in lockstep with each other. It's a very, very difficult kind of political environment to work in when the regulators and the regulated are kind of one and the same. So we are looking at ways where we can balance that influence of people and the oil and gas industry in the State House to some extent. And so what it's going to take is it's going to take a lot of us getting out and talking to our neighbors.
Yay! Now you're talking.
Yeah. So
That's huge.
So yeah, and if you know anything about the oil and gas industry, Tom Stewart from the Ohio Oil and Gas Association is that person who is getting these things done. So very undue influence. Okay, so injection wells. Oh, and that's our website, ohiosierraclub.org. You can find lots of great stuff there. Good. So injection wells. Chris talked about a little bit earlier. There are really, for most intensive purposes, really kind of three kinds of injection wells in Ohio. Two types are regulated by EPA. Those are the Class 1 and Class 3. Ohio DNR regulates the Class 2. That was delegated to them. Okay, so the oversight of the Class 2 injection wells was delegated from US EPA to Ohio EPA and then to ODNR. It's kind of a race to the bottom. You know, if you want someone to regulate something very softly, you give it to ODNR. Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry, go back again. I think folks kind of generally know about injection wells, but on the surface you'll generally have, and we're talking about Class 2 here, so that's the one in the middle, you'll typically have some storage tanks where the truck will pull in, they'll offload it in the storage tank, then there's a pump that pumps it down through, well, there's supposed to be a steel casing in the middle. Just outside the steel casing is an annulus area where there's a space, and then there's concrete. And at the bottom you have the zone of injection. There should be a confining formation above the zone of injection. In some cases there have not been. There's a current appeal on K&H number 2 well in Athens, Ohio, where they actually issued a permit for an injection well that has no confining layer between the zone of injection and the aquifer, which is really bizarre. And
Are you saying it doesn't go into a tank, it just gets pumped into the earth?
that's right, yeah. So, so it's pumped down through that steel casing I was talking about into the earth. The confining layer needs to be there. They do something called a mechanical integrity test on these, they're supposed to do. And that is where they basically pressurize the well to make sure that the casing hasn't cracked or if there is integrity failures in that casing on the way down to the zone of injection, the fluid can escape. We're talking about pressure into the thousands of PSIs. We're not talking about your air tires, which are 40 to 50, and it's a piece of rubber still hard as rock. We were talking about thousands of PSI. And so you can imagine if that integrity fails, it's going to be fairly simple for any fluid in there to migrate into the aquifer near the surface there and contaminate if there are nearby drinking water wells that are pumping out through groundwater. You could see a very drastic change in the makeup of your water. So you can go to the next slide. In 1996, the US EPA reviewed whether or not they wanted to consider brine to be hazardous or non-hazardous. In their final ruling, which was more or less pretty egregious in my opinion, they determined it to be non-hazardous, not because the chemical makeup wasn't dangerous, not because it couldn't make people really sick, but because basically in their words, there was so much of it that it would be virtually impossible for them to regulate so much hazardous material. And so that was the determination that led US EPA to label brine as non-hazardous. The 2005 Energy Policy Act, some folks know about that one from Gasland. That was some people also call it the Halliburton loophole that exempted oil and gas drilling waste from things like the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act. It created the ability to extend aquifer exemptions. So the US EPA can look at an aquifer, look at how many people use it as a drinking water source, or whether or not they believe that it's a viable drinking water source. And if they don't think so, then they can exempt that aquifer. And so basically you're just crossing off whole areas of potential drinking water sources off the map, allowing them to be drilled through for injection wells. So I already talked about the program delegations. Like I mentioned, the UIC program is administered by the Ohio Department of Natural Resources in Ohio. There are a lot of requirements that they're supposed to meet. We have been going through and doing, I mentioned the performance audit that the US EPA is doing. We've had some folks come and share their experiences in their communities with injection wells. They're monitoring injection wells in their community and looking at violations. I'm sorry, stay right there. So we're going to talk about some of the waste characterization. The endocrine disruption exchange is one of the only folks I'm aware of that actually did a fairly comprehensive characterization of what is in fracking fluid. You will hear industry say, well, it's 50 to 100 chemicals. You hear people say there's 200 or 300. They found over 700 chemicals. And as far as disclosure in Ohio, it's not required for industry to have to disclose all of their chemicals. They are required, they can post something voluntarily to something called Frack Focus, but then they can withhold some of those chemicals as proprietary. So if you go to the Frack Focus website and try to look at what is the chemical makeup of this well near my community, you might see a lot of lines that just say proprietary. And the reason that not disclosing the chemicals is so important for us, or such a problem for us, is that if someone's groundwater does get contaminated, you need to know what you're looking for and be able to trace it back to the source. So it's really important to us that these industries have to disclose the chemical they're looking at. And the US EPA is actually looking into a rulemaking process to create more transparency and also as far as the testing, the Ohio Department of Natural Resources provides a list of things you should test for. I would argue there's a lot more things than what's on that list than what you really should test for. So if you're in an area where you want to look at your groundwater, know what's in it before anything comes nearby, I would suggest maybe reaching out to Melanie or myself, and we can put you in touch with Julie Weatherington Rice, and she can get you a. That might be something good for us to get on our websites.
Yeah.
By the way.
If I could just say something real quick, Brian. We have provided tonight the chemical analysis from the state of New York, from the SGEIS report, which tested the flow back, the wastewater from Pennsylvania and New York, West Virginia, excuse me, from Pennsylvania and West Virginia that's being shipped into Ohio. So that is available over there. It's about 5 pages of those chemicals. And once it becomes waste, it's no longer proprietary. So what the state of New York did is test it and just broke it down into exact chemicals, no tricky names, and you can see what's in the waste that is being brought into Ohio and that's created by the hydraulic fracturing process. So, thanks.
Sure. Oh, and the last thing is once the drilling happens and that liquid starts to come back out, while that frac fluid is down there, as they put all the chemicals in, it picks up a lot of other stuff. Shale contains a lot of naturally occurring heavy metals. It's a really big point of contention last year that we had with the Ohio EPA. Was their Melanie, can I talk about this? Was their designation of this waste as norm, not T-norm? Our opinion was, well, yes, it's naturally occurring when it existed underground. When you brought it to the surface, then you technically enhanced it. We did not win on that argument, unfortunately. But when that fluid comes back out, it's picking up radium. We saw in the DNL dumping, Melanie also talked about that near Youngstown. When Lupo dumped all that stuff, they went on site and tested, and they found that the radium levels in the radiation in there was about 40 times the safe limit. So that was pretty substantial amount of radiation. And to be clear, no shale is going to be the same. sometimes you're gonna hit really hot pockets, like she was talking about with the drill cuttings that were really radioactive. Sometimes you might not. But I don't think that's something we can take chances on. And all the waste that's coming into the state, those drill cuttings are going to our landfills in Ohio. And that's because we do not have radiation detectors at our landfills, so they're not going to know when that stuff is coming in. And when radium goes into a landfill, and this is something that Julie Weinstein-Rice talks about all the time, that radium is really water soluble. So as soon as it rains in that landfill, that radium is going to trickle right out to the bottom, and it's going to go through a wastewater treatment plant, and then it's going to go into the river. So there's nothing that stops that radium from entering our waterways once it goes into the landfill. Next slide. This, I hear industry say sometimes, well, the chemicals in fracking are only less than 1%. Well, less than 1% of millions of gallons of water looks like this. This is the number of barrels of chemicals that go into one well. You can frack a well 6 to 8 times, and you start to pile those barrels up really quick. So we're talking about an amount, volume of chemicals that is really kind of hard to comprehend. When you start to talk about, you start to get in millions of gallons of things, that starts to really get beyond my mind. So I thought this would be a nice visual aid just for you all to be able to take a look at. Yes, it is less than, maybe it's only 1% of the volume, but that is a lot of chemicals. I think the blue barrels right there are hydrochloric acid. So, next slide. So Ohio's the dumping ground. This is Frack Tracker is one of our partners we work with pretty closely on trying to pull together data that's relevant to what we're talking about. Here they did a really nice job. So this gives you a sense of where most of the injections are happening. The bigger the orange dots are where they're injecting the most amount of fluid. You can see that areas are mostly on the eastern half of the state. Some of them start to trickle up this way, Morrow County. So we're getting pretty close here. And just to echo something that Chris said earlier, once you've got them here, your zoning ordinance is going to work. So it's a really important point that as you approach your council and you're asking them to take action to exercise their zoning rights to exclude this type of disposal as a zoning use, it's important that you do it before it gets here. So some folks say, well, you know, it's not here yet, so we don't have to worry about it. Well, that's exactly why you need to worry about it, because it's not here yet, so keep it that way. Why is so much waste coming to Ohio from Pennsylvania? Well, let me talk a little bit about what's so different about Ohio and Pennsylvania. The industry will tell you that the geology is better for injection wells in Ohio. Well, that may be true, but I'm sure there are plenty of places they could find to put injection wells. Ohio has that delegation from the US EPA that I was talking about. The US EPA allows the Ohio Department of Natural Resources to issue permits for wells. In Pennsylvania, it is the US EPA. They have not delegated the authority to issue permits for injection wells to that state. So what that means is in Ohio, under Ohio law, if you apply for a permit for an injection well, the Ohio Department of Natural Resources has to either issue or deny within 30 days that permit. 30 days. There will not be public hearings. They've never had a public hearing for an injection well. Even if folks request them, they will put a really small excerpt in a paper of circulation in your community saying that, you know, there's this permit application. In the opinion of the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, you do not have the right to appeal that permit. And so once that thing is done, it is done. And versus in Pennsylvania, it takes probably about a year. You're pretty much almost guaranteed that they're going to have to come and have a public hearing in your community about the injection well. They're going to be a lot more stringent about all the kind of things that the operator has to do. For example, every single well, I think there are only about 15 injection wells in Pennsylvania.
7 last night.
7?
Yeah,
or not, okay, not even 15. So there's 7 of these things in Pennsylvania. Every single one has a fence around it. So kids can't go get in there and start splashing around in the retention ponds and things like that. There are a lot more stipulations for what injection wells have to look like in Pennsylvania. They do exist. It can be done in Pennsylvania. The difference is that US EPA regulates it so much more stringently in Ohio Department of Natural Resources. And why is that? I already talked a little bit about some of the regulatory capture scenario. If the governor wants a state agency to make something happen, it will happen. He makes the appointments for the chief of the Ohio Department of Natural Resources. The governor makes the appointments for the chief of the Ohio EPA. We know that the governor was already forcing people out of the Ohio EPA. Scott Nally was pushed out. George Elmaragi was pushed out. So if you don't do what he wants you to do, which in this case is to make disposal of frack waste as affordable and cheap as possible, then you might lose your job. And then something else, the Dispatch is going to do an article about this weekend, is the Ohio Department of Natural Resources doesn't have the ability to even issue a fine for a violator. So I have a well pad that's spilling oil out of the tank is just leaking or dripping, like happens really often, into a retention pond, and then that's overflowing into a creek. So you have basically crude and brine and toxic or radioactive materials just flowing right into the creek. Well, what happens then is they get something called a notice of violation. A notice of violation can be a phone call, it can be an email, it can be a letter, and that's it. If they want to fine you, they have to go either to the state attorney general or they have to go to the county police department. If they send a referral to a county police department, they say, well, our county prosecutor doesn't even know how to prosecute this. We're busy trying to, keep people from killing each other and, using heroin in our communities. We're not worried about this. And if they send it to the attorney general's office, then it gets passed around about 4 different desks and nothing ever happens. And so there almost has never been any fines issued for violators. So there's no hammer to prevent these. And trust me, if you're an injection well operator, you know exactly what you can get away with and how far you can push it. And if you're trying to just make this really small operation as profitable as you can, you're going to do the least amount possible. There's no incentive for you, there's no financial incentive for you to comply with the law if they're not able to even issue a fine. So that's something that the Dispatch will be printing this weekend, so look forward to that. Next slide. So yeah, this shows you the number of violations. The red dots are hydrocarbons, so those could be things like pipelines as well. So this is after things have left the production well. The blue dots are disposal and enhanced recovery. So those are injection well violations. And then the yellow dots are specific to the site of the Class 2 injection wells. So if you go to the next slide, you can see the red line is the number of inspections that have happened. So they've increased the number of inspectors. So we're getting more inspectors at least. But what has happened with violations? Violations have stayed, that's the green line, this has stayed almost flat. So even though they're looking more, they're finding less. So there's a lot of different theories about why that is. I would expect, though, based on the condition we found, number of injection wells in the state, that there's no reason that those lines don't move together. So, next slide. And again, they're not issuing fines for these violations.
I'm just dying of curiosity. I think that was Holmes County that was almost solid orange. Do you have any idea why that was so?
I think it's Carroll County, isn't it?
No.
Or is that Holmes?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
They might have a lot of storage. I'll ask Ted.
Just curious.
Yeah. Yeah, that is
Yeah.
pretty significant. This is a ProPublica report. ProPublica found that 1 in 6 wells in Ohio that go through a mechanical integrity test fail that test, which means that the vertical tubing is failing in some place in there, and so that it's really high likelihood that the waste being injected is escaping way above the zone of injection. And then this data has to do with the number of wells drilled and the number of enforcement actions taken. Again, they're increasing the amount of wells, they've increased the number of staff, but somehow the number of enforcement actions have decreased. And again, I think that speaks to that political will that I was talking about. The production isn't doing well in the state, so the best way to incentivize keeping those drillers here is to make their waste disposal cheap.